Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. Today we are continuing with my bite-sized archaeology series. Now, we've talked about artifacts, we've talked about ecofacts, but there's one more big category of archaeological evidence that we haven't talked about yet, and that is features. Features are non-portable things that were created, altered, or used by humans. Generally, we work intention in here too, but there are cases where humans might unintentionally create non-portable things like the ashy layer that forms from a house catching fire or something like that. If it's non-portable and it was created, altered, or used by humans, usually it's categorized as a feature. Features can be any size, so long as they aren't portable. They could be small, like a pit dug to roast some potatoes, or they could be large, like the Temple of Kukulkan at Chichen Itza. They can be hearths, furnaces, roads, graves, houses, walls, anything that humans create that isn't portable. Now, in my other videos, we've talked about portability, meaning that you can fairly easily pick the thing up and move it, but it's actually not that clear cut. You'd be surprised how portable something can be if you try hard enough and you have the right equipment. There's actually so much gray area around portability that when I asked a few colleagues of mine what they defined as a feature and where they draw the line on portability, it led to several in-depth conversations about what portability for features meant and whether portability actually even mattered at all when it comes to features. Don't worry, we concluded that it does, but also that other things do too, which I'll get to in a minute. When it came down to it, we decided that artifacts were portable objects or finds that could be moved without significantly altering either the object or the space it used to occupy. So a standalone bookcase is generally an artifact instead of a feature, because even though you might remove the shelves to move the bookcase, you can put the shelves back in without damaging or changing either the bookcase or the space that it used to stand in. But if you have a bench like this, which forms part of the wall of the cloisters in an abbey, you can't move the bench without disconnecting it from the wall and leaving a big gaping hole where it used to be. So because of that, this bench would be considered a feature. Another element of the portability debate is that lots of things become portable with heavy machinery, but people in the past didn't necessarily have access to that type of machinery, depending on what we're talking about. Basically, if people in the past would be unable to move something with the technology that they had, then that doesn't count as portable either, even if we could move it today with our current technology. So what else besides portability makes a feature a feature? One factor is actually the degree of decay. While a standalone bookshelf is generally an artifact, the remains of that bookshelf after it's decayed and broken down into what is essentially a patch of dirt that has high amounts of organic residue is considered a feature. If we found pieces of the wood from that bookcase, we might class those as an artifact, but if not, the remains in the soil is usually considered a feature. Now, for larger non-portable things like the remains of a house, it's a feature regardless of how much it's decayed. So you could have the full house and it would still be a feature, or you could just have the remnants of the foundation and it would still be a feature. But for things that are in that gray area of portability, the level of decay can sometimes determine whether it's a feature or an artifact. Another factor in whether something is categorized as an artifact or a feature is how it will be recorded, collected, and cared for afterwards. The way that we care for artifacts tends to differ from the way we care for features, not because one is more important than the other, but because the things each type of archaeological find needs is usually different. Features tend to be kept in place or in situ and can be partially or entirely excavated depending on what we're trying to do. On the other hand, artifacts are recovered and taken to museums or labs or universities for study and preservation. So if something would benefit more from one style of recording and preservation than the other, we will class it as whichever category is best for that thing. And then there's the question of intention. Features are usually seen as intentional, but since they are often structures or at least things on a larger scale than many artifacts or ecofacts, there can be elements of them that are unintentional, and we would likely still call them a feature. One example is the remains of something organic that used to be in a particular spot. So if we think about our standalone bookcase example, there's intentional human activity around this bookcase, right? People built it, they put it where it is for a reason, and they used it intentionally. But as that bookcase decays and its remains turn into organic elements of the soil, we can argue that the humans who created and used that bookcase didn't necessarily intend for it to decompose and turn into dirt. Technically, this patch of differently colored soil that shows where the bookcase once stood wasn't made intentionally, but it's still often considered a feature because it is non-portable archaeological evidence that indicates intentional human activity at some point in the past. One thing to recognize here, which you may have noticed, especially in this discussion about features, is that these definitions that I've given about artifacts, ecofacts, and features are the general definitions archaeologists use, and they're really good if you're taking an archaeology course and studying for an upcoming exam. But the line between these definitions is often a bit nebulous and will probably differ at least slightly depending on who you're working with, what institutions you're working for, and also where in the world you are working, or even what time period you are working in. Probably the biggest distinction, though, is the one I mentioned earlier about how these categories of evidence are recorded, collected, and cared for. At the end of the day, archaeology is about preserving the past as best we can, while simultaneously doing what we can to learn from what we've found. So for everything we find, our first concern as archaeologists is how best to record, collect, and care for the thing in front of us, either through excavation or in situ or in-place preservation as a feature, through collection as an artifact, or through sampling as an ecofact. And just one final thing to point out, even though I've talked a lot about gray area, generally speaking, non-portable archaeological evidence is a feature, portable archaeological evidence that humans intentionally created, altered, or used is an artifact, and portable archaeological evidence that humans unintentionally created, altered, or used is an ecofact. And if you're curious about these differences that I'm talking about in how artifacts, ecofacts, and features are generally recorded, collected, and preserved in archaeology, keep an eye out for the next episode of Bite Size Archaeology, because that's what we're going to be talking about in the next episode. That's all from me for today. Thank you all for tuning in, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Bye!